I'm going to look here at the debate about Shakespeare and the idea that perhaps Shakespeare wasn't really Shakespeare. There are movies, there are people publishing stuff that say that Shakespeare didn't really write all of that stuff. So we're going to take a look at that today. Let's start off with the fact that I called it the authorship debate, putting debate inside inverted commas. That kind of suggests that in some way I don't really think it's a debate at all, doesn't it? I wonder if that's how I really feel. And sure enough, yes, that is how I feel. I feel it's not really an academic debate. It's not a topic for academics to talk about, really. It's mostly cranks, conspiracy theorists who are debating it, and scholars and academics will say, well, that's rubbish. We know that Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare. Okay? Some aspects of his life, well, we can debate about. We can talk about whether he was a Catholic, for example, or had Catholic sympathies. If we talk about that, we can find academics, good academics, who will say, yes, we believe that he was a Catholic, and you'll find good academics who will say, no, 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 I think he was a Protestant, or even that he was an atheist. So there are respected academics on both sides, or even on every side of that particular debate. But when it comes to whether Shakespeare really wrote the works published in his name, well, we're not really going to find reputable scholars who are going to argue that he didn't. So in that sense, it's a bit of a non-issue. It's hanashi ni narimasen. So, okay, then why are we talking about it? Well, okay, let me explain why I think it's important to discuss this topic. One reason is that students often want to write about it. And it's a good example of what makes the difference between a topic that can be considered suitable for academic debate and conspiracy theory topics, which is what this question basically really is. Let me try and develop that a little bit and explain what I mean. Starting round about the middle of the 19th century, there have been various people who have explored the question of whether the works that are said to have been written by Shakespeare were really his, or whether they were in fact written by somebody else. Now, those who support the idea that Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare, they're called Stratfordians. In other words, they believe that Shakespeare, who was born and lived in Stratford-on-Avon, is the same person who wrote the plays. And those people who think that somebody else wrote the works are called anti-Stratfordians as a general kind of word. Some of them might be called Baconians because they think that Francis Bacon wrote it or something like that. But in general, they're called anti-Stratfordians. So what are the anti-Stratfordians saying? Well, the main candidates that they have put forward as possible authors for Shakespeare's work are Sir Francis Bacon, Christopher Marlowe, Edward de Vere, and William Stanley. These four people are the ones that have been mostly suggested, although quite a lot of others at one time or another have been suggested as possible authors for Shakespeare's plays. Well, before we look at them as possible authors of Shakespeare's works, let's just take a look at the general situation. What is it that we know? How much do we know about Shakespeare himself? And what possible reasons could anybody have for thinking that he wasn't the true author of the plays published in his name? So let's start by taking a look at the historical Shakespeare, the person that we know about. Shakespeare the Man. Well, we know, for example, that he was born in this church in Stratford-on-Avon on the 26th of April. He was baptized on the 26th of April and would have been born just a few days before. How do we know it? Why do we know it? Well, it's because it's in the parish register. Okay, it's written there very clearly. We can see that Guillermus filius Johannes Shakespeare, William the son of John Shakespeare, written in Latin as was the custom in those days, is in the parish register. The parish register is a very old book, and there's no possible way that this could have been changed later on or messed around with in any way. Somebody called Shakespeare was definitely born and baptized on that particular day, and as was the custom, they would have been baptized a few days, a day or two after being born. So we know that much. So, what else do we know? Well, we know about Shakespeare's childhood home. We know pretty much that he lived and grew up in this house in Stratford-on-Avon. I say it's almost certain because the main proof is the fact that we know that his father opened a leather shop here some 10 years before Shakespeare was born and continued to live in this house for many years. So unless Shakespeare was growing up with some other family and wasn't growing up with his father and in his family, then he would have been living in this house. And he continued to live here. There's no record of him living anywhere else until 5 years after his marriage to a woman called Anne Hathaway, whom we'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. And Shakespeare's school. We can be fairly sure that Shakespeare went to this school here in Stratford-on-Avon between the ages of 7 and 14, which would have been the normal period of education. The school's still there, and you can still see the classrooms. It's still being used as a school. Unfortunately, the school records have been lost. So when we say that Shakespeare probably went to this school, we don't actually have the school records. On the other hand, there wasn't any other school for a long, long way around Stratford. It was the only school there at the time, and Shakespeare would have been allowed to go there free, given that his father had an official position on the town council. So it would have been very strange if he hadn't gone to that school. And we have an official town council record showing that John Shakespeare, William Shakespeare's father, was appointed as an alderman, and there's a later record that shows that he was promoted to bailiff. So here it is, John Shakespeare, alderman, appointed an alderman. All right, Shakespeare appointed an alderman as alderman. So we can see that record, and we assume from that that it means that his child would have gone freely to the local school. And Shakespeare's marriage. Again, there's pretty much no doubt about the fact that Shakespeare married this woman, Anne Hathaway. He would have been 18 years old, she would have been 26, and pregnant by him, what we call a shotgun wedding. And the church records, the record at Worcester Cathedral has 2 entries, and part of it reads William Shakespeare and on the one party, and Anne Hathaway of Stratford on the Diocese of Worcester, maiden may lawfully solemnize matrimony together. So we've got these kinds of records, again, from the church, showing that Shakespeare married Anne Hathaway in 1582. Shakespeare also had 1 or 2 interactions with the law. One of them shows him as a bit of a bad boy. Somebody called William Waite in 1596 complained that he was ob metum mortis, that means in fear of death, at the hands of Shakespeare and 3 other people. Now that expression, ob metum mortis, probably doesn't really mean that he was in fear of death. It just means that he'd been threatened by them, there'd been some kind of fight. What exactly it was all about, we don't know. There's only this document and we don't know anything else. It didn't go to court or anything. There are no records to show that Shakespeare was ever charged. Probably what happened was that Waite got into an argument with Shakespeare and some other actors over the theatre that they'd helped to establish in Southwark, where Waite lived, and which some of the local residents felt was noisy and a disturbance. So that's the probable reason why Shakespeare got into a little bit of trouble over some kind of disagreement with somebody living close to the theatre. Although it could be something else. As I say, we don't have all that much information, but it does show Shakespeare as a historical person. And And again, we see Shakespeare involved in a legal case in relation to a disputed dowry. Now, a dowry was money given by a woman's family when she married a man. The man would receive this dowry. And in this case, the man concerned was a friend of Shakespeare's, and the man decided in the end that he didn't want to be with that woman. So the question was, what happens to the dowry? And Shakespeare was a witness in this case, and he wrote a signed deposition in 1612. That would be fairly late on in his life, and his signature comes at the bottom of the page there. So these are the kinds of things that indicate that Shakespeare was really Shakespeare. So we have actually quite a lot of information about his life. We can see where he lived at different stages in his life. We can see him being identified in documents as an actor, a theatre manager, and as a dramatist. And the later part of his life in particular is really quite well documented. So we have quite a lot of information about the historical Shakespeare. We also know about his death. Firstly, a few weeks before he died in 1616, he signed a will in which he famously left his wife his second best bed. One guesses that he perhaps didn't care too much for his wife, but at any rate, that's a legal document written by Shakespeare shortly before his death. And we know also that he was buried in the same church where he was baptized back in Stratford-on-Avon. He did have an official position as a lay rector. That's a kind of, again, a low administrative position in the parish. So because of that, he was buried inside the church itself. And we also have these words written on his memorial: good friend, for Jesus' sake, forbear to dig the dust enclosed here. Blessed be the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones. So he didn't want anybody to mess around with his dead body. Okay, so this is the kind of information we have about Shakespeare's life. So, okay, it seems fairly clear then that there really was someone called Shakespeare. And the next step is, well, some people will say, yes, yes, there was somebody called Shakespeare, but did he really write the plays himself? So that becomes the next question that we need to look at. Most of the anti-Stratfordians do actually believe that most of what I've said. They would say it's true that there was a historical Shakespeare, though they may argue about some of the details there. In general, they will agree that there really was a William Shakespeare, but their argument in general will be that he was too low class, too uneducated to have written those plays. The Shakespeare that we know about, the historical Shakespeare, didn't go to university, for example, and these plays must have been written by somebody else, somebody who, for some reason, wanted to hide his identity. Okay, so we've got Shakespeare, but we've got some kind of mask. Behind the mask, who was he? All right, the idea that Shakespeare was a front, a name used by somebody else. This is the usual theory put forward by the anti-Stratfordians. So the argument really hinges quite centrally on whether Shakespeare was low class and uneducated. Now, he didn't go to university. There may have been reasons for that. One of the reasons put forward by those who think Shakespeare was a Catholic was the simple fact that Catholics weren't allowed to go to university in those days. So that's a possible reason. But rather than getting into that side of the question, I think we could learn a lot by looking at Shakespeare's friends, especially his friends in that area around Stratford-on-Avon where he grew up. Because if somebody else was using Shakespeare's name, they wouldn't have those friends, would they? I mean, they wouldn't have friends in the Stratford area. It would be very unlikely that none of the people that are suggested as being possible authors for Shakespeare lived in Stratford. So let's take a look at Shakespeare's friends in Stratford, because those are the friends of the historical Shakespeare. And if those friends are low class and uneducated, then we can suppose that he was probably similar to them. But on the other hand, if they're well educated and of a fairly high social status, then it would make sense to suppose that Shakespeare was also of a fairly well educated and socially respected social class. Okay, so let's take a look at some of Shakespeare's Stratford friends. Firstly, there's a letter. It's the only letter that survives that was written to Shakespeare that we have, and it was written by Richard Quiney, who was an old friend from Stratford at the time that Quiney was visiting London. Now, this letter itself doesn't tell us all that much, but we know from Quiney's other correspondence that he was an erudite, educated person, that he had high-ranking social and literary connections. For example, he wrote quite a few of his letters in Latin. Even one of his letters written by his 11-year-old son was written in Latin. And there's a letter also inviting Quiney to visit Sir Fulk Greville, who was the high-class father of a well-known poet. So not only was he well educated, but he had high-class associations, social contacts, and he had literary contacts. So he would fit the profile of the friend of somebody who might have written all those wonderful works that we classify as being written by William Shakespeare. He fits. Okay, let's move on to another of Shakespeare's Stratford friends. This one wrote a diary. There's not much, again, in the diary itself, there's not much that is really particularly relevant. It's mostly about practical stuff. It doesn't talk about Shakespeare the great dramatist or anything, but what's important again is the identity of the man who wrote it, who was Shakespeare's cousin, who was a close friend of Shakespeare. The two families had been friends for a long, long time. Green was a successful lawyer, he was a published poet, and he was a friend of Michael Drayton, another well-known poet, and of John Marston, a dramatist. So again, that very much fits the profile of a socially successful person who has literary connections, and Shakespeare is part of that world. And there are others. For example, there's Richard Field. He grew up in the same street as Shakespeare. He became a bookseller and a publisher with a large private collection of books. There's Thomas Russell, who was the executor of that will which we saw a little while ago. He had a half-brother who was a member of Parliament. We have Russell's stepson, also a member of Parliament. And we have Russell's stepfather, who was a good friend and neighbour of Sir John Harrington, the godson of Queen Elizabeth and the author of The Metamorphosis of Ajax. So what we're seeing here is a general picture of Shakespeare having friends from Stratford. All right, so they're closely connected to the historical Shakespeare. They're not friends of some other Shakespeare from somewhere else. They are friends of the same Shakespeare who are connected with literature, who are connected with high-class people in society, members of Parliament, and so on. And this is the kind of environment, this is the kind of social milieu that Shakespeare lived in. And what about the contemporary reactions? What were people saying about Shakespeare at that time? Well, the first printed mention of Shakespeare is in Francis Mere's work Paledistamia in 1598. And he is full of praise for Shakespeare. He says, as the soul of Euphorbus was thought to live in Pythagoras, so the sweet, witty soul of Ovid lives in mellifluous and honey-tongued Shakespeare. And he talks about Venus and Adonis and Shakespeare's sonnets and so on. Plautus and Seneca counted the best for comedy and tragedy among the Latins, so Shakespeare among the English. And carries on in that kind of way, listing several of his plays. And as Epiostolo said, the Muses would speak with Plautus's tongue if they could speak Latin, so I say that the Muses would speak with Shakespeare's fine filled phrases if they would speak English. So a lot of praise here for Shakespeare, and it's very much associated with the historical Shakespeare. For example, this mention of the sonnets. Now, Shakespeare's sonnets circulated among his friends before they were published. This was very typical of poetry in those days. And Meres knows about these sonnets 9 years before they're published. So he must have been close to at least somebody in Shakespeare's circle. So if the sonnets weren't really written by Shakespeare, why did Meres and everyone else who read them keep the true authorship secret? How could a secret like that be kept for such a long time and by so many different people? Okay, so what we have is a conspiracy theory, that it was all a big plot to hide the identity of the person who really wrote the plays. Meres's praise of Shakespeare is just one of many comments on Shakespeare's writing that we had that were written in his own lifetime. Some of those comments were written by people who knew him personally. Some of them were written by people who didn't like him and were criticizing him, attacking him. People who disapproved of him or disagreed with him, as well as people who praised him. Isn't it rather peculiar that not one of these people ever suggested that Shakespeare was not the author of the works? Even after his death, there was not even a hint of any such thing. It wasn't actually until the 19th century that anybody even suggested that Shakespeare may not have been the true author. And the only way that could be true is if Shakespeare's friends and the friends of the true author, remember both sets of friends would have to keep it secret and never spoke about it to anyone until their death. And given that writing, producing and publishing plays was a very public kind of thing, because he'd be working together with the actors on the script and this sort of thing, it would be very difficult for it to be just a private secret between Shakespeare and the true author. It would have to be a real conspiracy that other people knew about, and yet they kept it secret. Why would they have done that? How could they have done that? And who would the possible alternative Shakespeares be? Well, these are the candidates, as I said before, the most popular candidates for Shakespeare's true identity. The first one, the one we most often hear about, is Francis Bacon. Okay, well, Bacon was a famous person in his own right. He was a scientist, he was a statesman, he was a lawyer, and he wrote a huge amount in Latin and in English. It's really hard to see how somebody who had such a full life as Bacon could also have been the greatest playwright England has ever produced. How much energy could one person have? Another thing is that his writings show a way of thinking. He's very logical, he's very analytical. His way of thinking is really, really very different from that of Shakespeare. His style and the content of his writing is completely different. So I'm going to say no. I'm going to say bin it. All right? Toss it in the bin. Throw it in the rubbish. It's not a possibility that Francis Bacon wrote Shakespeare. Bin it, say I, and burn it. That idea, as far as I'm concerned, just doesn't stand up. Okay, and number 2, Christopher Marlowe. Well, the biggest problem with the theory that Marlowe wrote Shakespeare's plays is that Marlowe was murdered before Shakespeare's plays were most of them had ever even been written. So in order to substantiate or to bolster this claim that Marlowe wrote Shakespeare, you'd have to say that, oh, it's a trick, Marlowe didn't really die, which is pretty difficult to claim because his murder was one of the most famous things that happened. It's very, very well documented, one of the most well documented events in Elizabethan history. So we know an awful lot about how Marlowe was murdered. And even if it's possible then that was all a cover-up, that was all a trick, he didn't really die and he kept on publishing in Shakespeare's name for the next 20 years, why on earth would he have wanted to? What would have been the point? Right? There's no rhyme or reason, really, why Marlowe would have even wanted to pretend that he wasn't himself, that he would have wanted to stage his own death, and so on. It's all very peculiar. And again, I would say there's no real credibility to this. And bin it, put it in the bin, and burn it. That's all it's good for, as far as I'm concerned. And the next one. Edward de Vere. Well, Edward de Vere, he did live for 10 years longer than Marlowe, but he still died about 10 years before Shakespeare stopped writing. So to sustain this one, people will say that he wrote a supply of plays which was slowly released for publication after his death. That doesn't work. It just doesn't work. Some of the works that were written after Edward de Vere's death, some of the works that Shakespeare published, refer to events that happened after 1604, after the death of Edward de Vere. It's really very unlikely that Edward de Vere could have known that these things were going to happen after his death, isn't it? And we've also got the fact that Mears, remember the first person who mentions Shakespeare, also mentions de Vere and lists him separately. Why would he list those two writers separately if he knew that in fact they were the same person? So again, bin it, say I. Burn it, say I. The idea doesn't stand up. There's no mileage in this theory. And finally, they're dropping like flies here. Finally, William Stanley. He gives us the opposite problem because he didn't die before Shakespeare, he died many years after Shakespeare. So why on earth would he have not carried on writing after the historical Shakespeare died? Isn't that a bit bizarre? He's the weakest candidate, perhaps, of the four. And there are documents that say that he wrote comedies for the common players and that he took delight in the players, but we don't have any works written by him, and that's part of the reason why people say, no, you don't have works written by him because they were all published in Shakespeare's name. But there's really very, very little evidence to suggest that there's any truth at all in that. And once again, bin it, burn it. These ideas just don't really stand up. So, in conclusion, in the end, the biggest problem we have with these anti-Stratfordian theories is that all through Shakespeare's life and for another 200 years after he died, there was nobody who even whispered that he wasn't the true author of the plays. So, if there was a secret true author, and it's really hard to see how that secret could have been kept such a secret that nobody suspected it, not even when he was alive or even after he died. There was no whisper of it. Nobody said anything for 200 years. And basically, the other thing that we can say is that we do have as much evidence for Shakespeare, the historical Shakespeare, Shakespeare the Man, being the writer of the works, as we have for almost any other writer of that period. People would say, isn't it strange that we don't have, for example, the record that shows that he went to that school or something like that. We only have the supposition that he went there because his father would have been entitled to give William free education because of his job. We're talking about hundreds of years ago here. Papers have got lost. Records are not complete. There's nothing particularly mysterious about the paperwork that we have relating to Shakespeare. There's nothing particularly mysterious about the documents that survive. It's pretty typical for that period. Okay? And we've got more than 80 different people that have been suggested as possible authors, and we've looked at 4 of them, and I've given, I think, fairly good arguments why those 4 don't really work as the author of Shakespeare's plays and other works, his poetry. And the real reason for that is that there is only one real William Shakespeare, and his name is William Shakespeare. And that's the end of the story. Okay? Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare. Okay? And that's it for today. Thank you.